She had 43 missed calls on her phone and not a single person who actually gave a damn whether she made it home. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 days, and the only reason he kept moving was a 6-year-old girl who still believed her father had everything under control. 2 strangers. 1 crowded platform. An empty seat that nobody wanted to take. What happened next didn't make headlines. Nobody filmed it. Nobody shared it. But it changed both of their lives in ways that money couldn't buy and grief couldn't destroy. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. Because the stories we tell on this channel have a way of staying with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like if something moves you. And tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? I read every single one, and every time I see a new place on that list, it reminds me why these stories matter. Now, settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. The 447 out of Garfield Station was always a mess. Mason Reed knew this the way he knew the particular groan his water heater made at 6 a.m., the way he knew which step on their apartment staircase creaked loudest, the way he knew his daughter's face when she was about to cry even before her chin started to tremble. He knew it because he rode that train every single weekday, had been riding it for going on 4 years now, and in all that time the 447 had never once been anything other than packed, loud, and slightly too warm for comfort. Today was no different. He shouldered through the main entrance of Garfield Station at 4:39, hard hat tucked under one arm, his work bag hanging off his shoulder with the broken zipper he kept meaning to fix. His shirt had a grease smear across the left sleeve from where he'd been elbow deep inside an elevator shaft on the 14th floor of a downtown office building since roughly 8 that morning. He smelled like machine oil and sweat, and the fast food sandwich he'd eaten standing up at noon because there hadn't been time to sit down. He was 33 years old, and he felt about 52. The main concourse was doing what it always did on a Thursday afternoon, churning with people who all seemed to believe their particular destination was more urgent than everyone else's. Mason moved through the crowd the way he'd learned to move through tight spaces at work, economical, not aggressive, angling his shoulders when he needed to and keeping his eyes on where he was going rather than on the people in his way. Platform 7. That's where he needed to be. He checked his phone as he walked. One message from his neighbor, Mrs. Papadopoulos, the 71-year-old Greek woman who watched Lily on the afternoons he worked late. She ate all her dinner already, asking for you. Don't rush, she's fine. He typed back, on my way, thank you, and dropped the phone back in his pocket. Lily, 6 years old, currently sitting in Mrs. Papadopoulos' kitchen, probably eating her second helping of whatever the woman had made, because Lily had inherited her mother's complete inability to say no to good food. The thought of it, his daughter at that kitchen table, feet swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor yet, probably talking Mrs. P's ear off about something she'd learned at school. It was the thing that pulled him forward through the noise and the heat and the bone-deep exhaustion of another day. It was the only thing that had been pulling him forward for 6 years. Platform 7 was standing room only. Mason found a spot near the far end, set his bag down between his feet, and leaned back against the tiled wall. Around him, people stared at their phones or their shoes or the middle distance, doing that thing commuters do where they make themselves as internally small as possible to compensate for how physically close they're forced to be to strangers. Someone nearby was listening to music loud enough that Mason could make out the bass line. A kid about 15 feet away was having an argument in hushed, furious tones on his phone. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment. He'd been awake since 5:15. He'd gotten Lily ready, packed her bag, dropped her at school, ridden the 712 to the job site, spent 8 hours dealing with a cable drum assembly that the previous maintenance crew had apparently serviced with their eyes closed, filed his report, packed up, and now here he was. And when he got home tonight, there'd be dinner to think about, and Lily's reading homework she'd asked him to help with, and the stack of bills on the kitchen counter he'd been avoiding looking at directly. He wasn't complaining. That wasn't what this was. He was just tired. Quietly, thoroughly, down to the marrow tired, in the way that didn't go away with a good night's sleep, because it wasn't the kind of tired that came from not sleeping enough. It came from somewhere deeper than that, from carrying something alone that was meant to be carried by 2 people. He opened his eyes when he heard it. Not a crash, not anything dramatic, just the particular sound of a wheelchair wheel catching on the uneven lip of pavement where the platform met the pedestrian walkway. That sharp little jolt, and the involuntary sound a person makes when they've nearly lost control of something. He spotted her immediately. She was maybe 20 feet away, navigating toward the platform benches, and she'd gotten one wheel caught on the seam and was struggling to free it without making a scene, which, Mason could see, was exactly what she wanted. To handle it quietly, to not make a scene, to get where she was going without anyone needing to look at her. The problem was, nobody was helping. It wasn't that people were being cruel. They weren't. They were doing what people on crowded train platforms do. They were looking past her, looking around her, looking at their phones, moving in the paths that didn't involve stepping toward the woman in the wheelchair who clearly had a problem. Whether it was discomfort or obliviousness or just the particular urban reflex of not my business, the result was the same. She was stuck, and she was alone in a crowd of 100 people. Mason picked up his bag and walked over. "You got it, or you want a hand?" She looked up at him, quick, sharp, evaluating. The look of someone who'd learned to read a stranger's intentions fast. She had dark hair pulled back simply, and she was wearing clothes that didn't match the quality of her watch. Ordinary dark jacket, plain gray top. No makeup, or if there was, it was subtle. Brown eyes that were, he noticed, currently deciding whether he was a problem. "I've got it," she said. "Okay." He stood where he was. She worked the wheel, applied pressure to the left side of the chair to lift the right, and maneuvered free of the seam. Clean. Efficient. She'd done this 1,000 times. "Thanks for the company," she said, with a dryness that wasn't quite unfriendly. "Platform's always a mess on Thursdays," Mason said. "Something about the seam there. I've almost tripped over it myself." She didn't respond to that immediately. She glanced toward the benches, which were full, and then toward the area beside them where there was technically floor space, but nowhere comfortable to be. "There's a spot down here," Mason said, and he wasn't sure exactly why he said it. He gestured toward the far end of the platform where there was a recessed section slightly apart from the main crowd, originally designed for oversized luggage, but functionally underused. Little less chaos. She looked at him again with that same measuring quality. "You're going to carry my chair?" The dryness was sharper this time. Testing. "I was just going to walk next to you," he said. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not a smile, just a recalibration. "All right," she said. Her name, she told him, was Evelyn. Just Evelyn, offered with a kind of practiced simplicity that he'd later understand was the version of herself she gave to strangers. Incomplete on purpose. Not dishonest exactly, but curated. She was 30, she said, when he mentioned he was 33. She said it like it was just a number, not worth anything more than that. They stood, she parked, he stood, in the recessed section at the end of Platform 7 and waited for the 447, and something happened that Mason hadn't expected. She was easy to talk to. Not in the way of someone who was performing ease, who was doing the bright small talk thing people do when they're uncomfortable. She was just direct. She asked him what the grease stain was from, and he told her about the cable drum, and she asked a follow-up question that made it clear she actually understood the mechanics of what he was describing, which was unexpected enough that he looked at her sideways. "I spent some time on an engineering project," she said when he raised an eyebrow. "In a previous life." "What do you do now?" She seemed to consider how to answer that. "I work in an office," she said. "Lots of meetings. Very few of them interesting." He told her about Lily. He didn't usually do that with strangers, but she'd asked what was making him check his watch. And when he explained, his daughter, the neighbor's place, the reading homework, Evelyn had asked how old, and when he said 6, the expression on her face did something genuine, something unguarded. "My sister was 6 when I learned to ride a bike," she said. And then, like she'd said more than she meant to, she used to run next to me holding the back of the seat until I yelled at her to let go. It wasn't a complete story. It was just a piece of one, but it felt like an offering. The train pulled in with the usual noise and the crowd surged forward. The car was packed. Mason managed to get into position near the doors, and This was the thing he did without quite thinking about it. The automatic male calculation of bodies and space that happened at subconscious speed. He used his bag and his shoulder to hold just enough room that Evelyn could get in without being jostled. He didn't announce it. He didn't say, "Here, let me help you." He just angled himself and it worked. Inside the car, the seating situation was the usual disaster. Every bench taken, the aisle full of standing commuters, and the designated accessible space occupied by a woman with a stroller who was either genuinely unaware of the signage or had decided the signage didn't apply. Evelyn didn't say anything. She positioned herself in a space that wasn't ideal and gripped the armrest of her chair and prepared to ride out the journey. Mason leaned over to the stroller woman. "Hey, sorry, would you mind? The accessible space?" "There's nowhere else," the woman said, not unkindly, just frazzled. I know, but..." He glanced at Evelyn, then back. "She's having a hard time getting stable." The woman looked. Something moved across her face. Oh, right. Yes, okay, one sec." She maneuvered the stroller with the particular focused chaos of someone juggling too many things and freed up the space. He didn't look at Evelyn while this happened. He was looking at the stroller, helping guide it, making room. When the train started moving, he found himself standing across the aisle, holding the overhead bar, and Evelyn was beside him, or as beside him as the geometry allowed. "You didn't have to do that," she said. She couldn't see the sign from where she was standing. "That is not why you did it." He shrugged. "It worked out the same." The train moved through the afternoon. Outside, the city slid past. Office buildings giving way to mixed retail, then residential blocks, then the greener sprawl of the neighborhoods. They didn't talk the entire ride. There were long stretches of quiet that weren't awkward, which was strange for people who had met 19 minutes ago. At one point, she asked him how long he'd been doing elevator work. He said 4 years, give or take. Before that? Construction, structural. He paused. Before that, some other things. She didn't push. He noticed she didn't push, and that itself felt like something. His stop was before hers. He'd known that would be the case, but he hadn't thought much about it until the automated announcement came, and he had to shift toward the doors. He picked up his bag. He nodded at her. "Safe trip the rest of the way." "You too." And then, because he was almost at the doors, and the moment was almost gone. "It's a good city for watching sunsets from the train. If you get a window seat on the west side." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He stepped off the platform. The doors closed. The train moved. He walked the 4 blocks to Mrs. Papadopoulos's building with his bag on his shoulder and the grease stain on his sleeve, and the memory of brown eyes doing that rapid calibration thing. He almost didn't notice the folded paper in his jacket pocket until he was on the stairs. It was small, white, folded into the shape of a flower, a simple one, the kind you make with a square of paper and enough patience. He had no memory of her putting it there, had no idea when she'd done it or how, or whether it had been intentional or fallen from her pocket or what. He stood there on the 3rd-floor landing holding this small paper flower, and he looked at it for a long moment. Then he went inside, where his daughter launched herself off the couch and into his arms, talking before she'd even fully made contact, something about a caterpillar she'd found at recess, and what Mrs. P had made for dinner, and whether they could get a library book about caterpillars on Saturday. "Sure," he said, holding her with one arm, the paper flower still in his other hand. He set it on the kitchen counter while he made coffee. He kept looking at it all through dinner. He was still thinking about it 3 hours later when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet and he was sitting at the table going through the bills he'd been avoiding. And he couldn't have said exactly why a small paper flower from a stranger on a train occupied that much of his head. But it did. It stayed there, folded in white, on the corner of his kitchen counter. And he didn't throw it away. He told himself he wasn't looking for her. That first Monday after the Thursday on Platform 7, Mason got to Garfield Station at 4:41 instead of 4:39. He told himself it was because he'd had to file a secondary report on the cable drum situation, which was true, and that the 2 extra minutes had nothing to do with anything else, which was less true. He positioned himself in the same recessed section at the far end of the platform, and he watched the crowd and he waited for the 447, and she wasn't there. Fine. Of course she wasn't there. She was a stranger he'd talked to for 20 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. People had different schedules. People didn't ride the same train every day. He rode home alone and made Lily pasta with the jarred sauce she liked, and helped her sound out words in a library book about butterflies. They hadn't found one specifically about caterpillars, but this was close enough. And Lily had accepted the substitution with the pragmatic flexibility of someone who understood that the world didn't always provide exactly what you asked for. He didn't think about Evelyn again until he was washing dishes and noticed the paper flower still sitting on the corner of the counter. Tuesday, she wasn't there either. Wednesday, he almost didn't go to the far end of the platform. He'd spent the afternoon on a job in a building with no functioning air conditioning, and he was in a worse mood than usual, and the idea of standing in that specific spot on that specific platform, waiting for a person who had no reason to be there, felt, in the uncharitable light of Wednesday at 4:43, a little pathetic. He went anyway. She was there, not at the benches. She'd found the recessed section herself this time, positioned near the wall, reading something on her phone with the focused attention of someone who'd trained herself to be unreachable in public spaces. She was wearing a different jacket today, dark green, and her hair was down instead of pulled back. She looked different with her hair down. Not softer exactly, just less armored. She looked up when he walked over, and something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Not surprise, something quieter than that. "The cable drum guy," she said. "The office meetings woman," he said. She almost smiled. "I got a window seat on the west side last Thursday." "Sunset?" "Decent one. Clouds were in the way for most of it." She paused. "Still worth looking at." He set his bag down and stood next to her, and they waited for the train, and it was almost exactly like the Thursday before, except that this time neither of them pretended it was accidental. That was how it started. Not with a declaration or a decision or anything that either of them would have been able to point to later and say that was the moment. It was just that Mason started taking the 447 from Platform 7 and Evelyn started being there, and gradually the space between them on that platform became a place where certain things were possible that weren't possible anywhere else. By the third week, he knew she took green tea instead of coffee, that she had opinions about architecture that were more specific and technical than you'd expect from someone who described themselves as working in an office, and that she had a way of going completely still when she was thinking. Not checked out still, but concentrated, like a person doing math in their head. She knew he'd grown up in the same city, that his father had worked construction before him, and that Lily's full name was Lily May, which had been his wife's suggestion, offered quietly in a hospital room during what turned out to be the last hours anyone got to spend with Claire Reed. He hadn't meant to tell her that last part. It came out one afternoon when Evelyn asked if Lily's name had a story behind it, and something about the directness of the question, the genuine curiosity without any of the careful tiptoeing that people usually did around the subject of his wife, made him just answer it honestly. "My wife picked it," he said. "She died the day Lily was born." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who didn't know what to say and was frantically searching for it, but the quiet of someone who understood that some things didn't need a response right away. "That's a terrible thing to carry," she finally said. "Yeah. Does it get lighter?" He thought about it. The train was pulling in, and around them people were starting to move. "It doesn't get lighter," he said. "You just get stronger, or you pretend to, long enough that it becomes the same thing." She looked at him with those dark eyes doing their calibration thing, and she nodded once, like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. They got on the train. He started bringing coffee for himself and green tea for her. The first time he did it, she looked at the cup he held out and then up at him with an expression that was genuinely unreadable. "You didn't have to do that." "It was on the way." "The tea cart is not on the way from the elevator bank to Platform 7. "I went a different way today." She took the cup. She didn't thank him immediately, which he found he didn't mind. She looked at it the way she looked at most things, appraisingly, like she was deciding whether it was trustworthy. Then she took a sip and said, "This is actually good." I asked what kind of green tea. The cart woman knows her inventory. You asked a T-card operator about her inventory. She was enthusiastic about it. Apparently there's a difference between the two types she carries. Evelyn shook her head very slightly, looking somewhere between amused and something harder to name. You're a strange person, Mason Reed. Probably, he agreed. The city changed around them as October leaned into November. The light on the platform went from gold to gray earlier each afternoon. People switched from light jackets to heavier coats. Mason started wearing the dark wool coat he only brought out when the temperature dropped below 50, and Evelyn appeared one day in a burgundy scarf that she'd wrapped twice around her neck and that somehow made her look both warmer and more serious at the same time. She talked about books the way other people talked about old friends, with real affection and occasional exasperation, like they'd let her down sometimes, but she couldn't quite give up on them. She was working through a novel about a lighthouse keeper that she described as slow, but worth it, which Mason suspected was how she approached most things. She asked him what he read, and he admitted he mostly read whatever Lily brought home from the school library, and instead of treating that as an admission of something lacking, she'd said, "That's actually not a bad way to build a reading list. Kids have instincts about stories." She talked about sunsets with a specificity that surprised him. Which directions and times and weather conditions produced the best ones, which cloud formations worked in your favor, and which just blocked everything. He realized after a while that she'd been cataloging them, that she kept track. "From the train?" he asked once. "From wherever I happened to be." A beat. "I used to hike, for sunsets specifically. There was a trail about 40 minutes outside the city with this one ridge. You could see in 3 directions at once." She said it the way people describe something they've come to peace with mostly. "I haven't been up there in a couple of years." He understood what she was saying without her having to say it directly. He didn't push. She didn't offer more. But he noticed, after that conversation, that she always angled slightly toward the west-facing windows on the train if there was room, even when it meant an awkward position, like she was keeping a promise to herself. He didn't see the wheelchair first anymore. He hadn't for a while, though he couldn't pinpoint when that had shifted. He saw her, Evelyn, this particular person with her dry humor and her architectural opinions and her cataloged sunsets, and the chair was just part of the picture, the way his grease-stained work shirts were part of his picture, just the material conditions of a person's life. She never told him what she did. He'd stopped expecting her to, though there were cracks in the ordinary office worker version of herself that she maintained. The way she spoke about corporate structures with an insider's familiarity that went beyond someone attending meetings. The day her phone went off 3 times in 6 minutes, and she silenced it each time with the automatic decisiveness of someone who is used to being the person people called, not the person who called. Once, when he mentioned a local tech company that had been in the news over a contract dispute, she'd said, "Their legal team is actually solid. They'll settle," with a certainty that made him look at her sideways. "How do you know that?" "Someone told me," she said, and moved on. He let it go. He didn't know why she was keeping whatever it was she kept, and he'd decided somewhere along the way that it wasn't his to demand. She'd tell him when she told him, or she wouldn't. Either way, she was here, on this platform, at 4:41 every weekday that the schedule allowed, and that was enough. Lily knew about her in the abstract. He'd mentioned the woman from the train the same way he mentioned other things from his day, naturally, in passing, while making dinner or helping with homework. Lily, who had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's directness and absolutely no filter between thought and speech, had asked 2 questions. 1, was she nice? And 2, did she like caterpillars? Mason had said yes to the first, and that he hadn't asked yet to the second. "You should ask," Lily said, with the authority of a 6-year-old who considered this obvious. One Friday in late November, Mason got to platform 7, and the space at the far end was empty. He waited. The crowd built and thinned. The 4:47 came and went. He stood there for 20 minutes past its departure, which he had not planned to do, and then he rode the 5:09 home alone. Saturday passed. Sunday. He found himself looking at his phone without anything specific to look for, which was an unproductive habit, and he knew it. Monday she was back. She looked tired in a specific way, not sleep-tired, but the tired that comes from something ongoing and unresolved. Friday? he said, which wasn't really a question. I had to handle something. She paused. At work. Everything okay? It will be, said with the flat certainty of someone managing a situation rather than resolving one. She took the green tea he offered and wrapped both hands around it. How was your weekend? Lily found an actual caterpillar in the park. She wants to know if you like them. Something softened in Evelyn's expression in a way that happened sometimes when Lily's name came up, quick and unguarded before she reassembled. I don't have strong feelings either way about caterpillars. I'll pass that along. She'll want your position on butterflies too, for the record. I can live with butterflies. He told her about the park, about the caterpillar, about the 45-minute negotiation that had ended with Lily agreeing not to bring it home in her jacket pocket. By the time he'd gotten through the story, some of the tension in Evelyn's shoulders had settled. Not all of it, but some. December came in cold. The platform was miserable in the cold. The wind cut across it from the northeast, and there was no good shelter in the recessed section where they'd started meeting. Mason wore a knit hat he'd owned since college. Evelyn had a pair of gloves that looked expensive, thin, and very dark, and she wore them every day now. They'd started talking about harder things. It happened gradually, the way trust always does. You share one thing, and nothing bad comes of it, and then you share another. Evelyn told him about her sister, whose name was Diana and who lived in another city and who called every Sunday without fail. She said it with a particular quality in her voice, gratitude underneath irritation, the way you feel about the people who refuse to let you disappear. She doesn't take no for an answer, Evelyn said. Smart woman. Insufferable is what she is. But her voice was warm when she said it. She asked him once about Claire. Really asked. Not the surface version, not what was she like in the way people asked because they felt they should. She asked what he missed that nobody talked about. The weird, specific things. He hadn't expected the question, and it caught him without his defenses up, which was probably why he actually answered it. She used to leave cabinet doors open, he said. Every single one. She'd get something out and just leave it. I used to complain about it. After she died, the cabinets were always closed, and I couldn't stand it. He stopped. That sounds insane. It doesn't. I started leaving them open myself for a while, just one or two of them. So the kitchen didn't look so different. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What did you do with her things? Kept most of them too long, then gave most of them away. He exhaled. Kept a few things. A sweater she loved, some books, her handwriting on a grocery list. A grocery list? It was in her handwriting. He shrugged, a little helpless. That's what I had. Yeah, Evelyn said softly. That makes complete sense. He looked at her. You've lost someone. It wasn't a question. She took a slow breath. My accident wasn't just about me, she said. There were two other people in the car. A long pause. One of them was my fiancé. The word landed between them with the full weight of what it contained. He didn't make it, she said, and her voice was level in the deliberate way of someone who had worked very hard to make it level over a long period of time, through a lot of repetition. Evelyn, I'm okay. Quick, practiced. Then, after a beat, I'm not always okay, but I'm functional, which is different, and usually that's enough. He didn't say he was sorry because she'd clearly had enough sorries to last the rest of her life. He said, What was his name? She looked at him sharply like she hadn't expected that particular question. Daniel, she said. Was he funny? Something moved across her face. He was terrible at jokes, she said. He tried constantly and the punchlines never landed, and he'd laugh at his own jokes before he finished telling them. A pause, and something close to a real smile, small and unguarded. It was somehow more endearing than annoying. Sounds like he was annoying as hell. She laughed. Actual, quiet, unprepared laughter. He absolutely was. They stood on the platform in the December cold with their warm drinks and the wind coming off the northeast and the noise of the city all around them, and something shifted in the space between them that wasn't romantic. Not yet, not close to yet. It was something earlier and more fundamental than that. The particular feeling of being known by another person, of having handed something fragile to someone and watched them hold it with care. The first week of January, Mason arrived at Platform 7 at 4:41 and she wasn't there. He waited. He didn't ride the 4:47. He waited for the 5:09. She didn't come for that one either. He figured she was handling something at work again. He rode home and made dinner and helped Lily with the worksheet her teacher had sent home about addition with double digits, which Lily found annoying, and Mason secretly agreed was a bit much for a 6-year-old, but kept that to himself. The next day she wasn't there. The day after, same thing. By the 4th day, Mason was doing something he didn't usually do, which was standing on Platform 7, unable to think about anything else. He tried to be reasonable about it. People got sick, people traveled. She had a whole life outside of this platform that he knew almost nothing about, because that was how this had worked. They existed here, in this specific geography, and he'd been fine with that, had chosen to be fine with it. He wasn't fine with it now. On the 6th day, he did something that required him to do a thing he'd been, until now, deliberately not doing. He looked her up. He had a last name, Cross. He had a first name. He typed Evelyn Cross into his phone's browser, standing in his kitchen at 9 p.m. after Lily was asleep, and what came back stopped him cold. The first result was a business profile. The second was a profile piece from a financial magazine published 18 months ago. The third was a news item from 2 years before that, about a limousine accident during a company event in which 3 people had been injured, one fatally. He stood in his kitchen and read, Evelyn Cross, 30 years old, CEO of Crossfield Technologies, a data infrastructure company that, according to the magazine profile, had revenues exceeding $300 million annually. Named one of the youngest chief executives in the company's sector. Known for being strategically sharp and personally private. The accident piece was brief and factual. He didn't read it twice. He set his phone down on the counter next to the paper flower. Still there, still in the same spot, gone slightly soft at the edges over the months. And he stood there for a long time doing nothing. He wasn't angry. Or he was, a little, but not at her. He was angry at the situation, at the fact that this person he'd been standing next to on cold platforms for 3 months had been managing an entire weight of identity that she'd had good reasons not to share. He understood the reasons. He didn't love the feeling. Both of those things were true. The 7th day he went to the platform. He went because not going was worse. He went because regardless of the LinkedIn profiles and the magazine pieces and the numbers involved, the woman he knew had told him Daniel's name and laughed at his cabinet door story and known, somehow, to bring the conversation about Claire around to the specific weird things rather than the generalities. That person was real. Whatever else was also real, that person was real. He stood at the far end of Platform 7 and waited. She didn't come. On the 9th day, he called in a favor from a former coworker who'd done some building maintenance at Crossfield's corporate offices. Not to get information, just to confirm he had the right building. He went there at noon on a Wednesday, which required rearranging his schedule in a way that his supervisor was not completely satisfied with. The lobby of Crossfield Technologies was the kind of lobby that communicated seriousness through restraint. Nothing flashy, everything expensive, the particular aesthetic of a place that didn't need to impress you because it assumed you already knew. He walked in with his work jacket on and asked the woman at the front desk if he could leave something for Evelyn Cross. The woman looked at him with the polite blankness of someone trained to be politely blank. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, He stopped. "A friend. I'm a friend of hers. I just wanted her to know I've been thinking about her." The woman's expression stayed professionally neutral, but he saw something move behind her eyes. People in lobbies like this had calibrated instincts for who belonged and who didn't, and Mason, in his work jacket with his tool bag, was not the typical visitor profile for a CEO's office. "I can take a message," the woman said. He thought for a moment. He didn't have paper on him. He checked his jacket pockets and found what he often found in jacket pockets: a gas station receipt, a pen that worked, and a crumpled square of paper that wasn't quite the right size but would do. He wrote, "Platform 7. I know, it doesn't change anything. M." He folded it into the best approximation he could manage of a square, and then, because it seemed right, he kept folding until it was roughly the shape of a flower. Not a good one. His origami was not even close to hers. But the intention was clear enough. He handed it to the lobby woman. 3 days later, he got a text from an unknown number. Room 412, Mercy General. I tell you not to come, but you'd probably come anyway. He went the next evening after dropping Lily at Mrs. Papadopoulos's, and when he pushed open the door of room 412 at Mercy General Hospital, what he found stopped him in the doorway for a moment before he could make himself move. Evelyn was sitting up in the hospital bed, her wheelchair folded against the wall, her hair loose and uncombed in a way he'd never seen it. She was thinner in the face than she'd been on the platform. There were dark circles under her eyes that weren't from missed sleep, but from something more sustained than that. There were flowers on the windowsill that looked like corporate send-along flowers, the kind purchased from a card rather than chosen, and a get-well card propped against the vase that she'd clearly opened and set aside without reading closely. There was no one else in the room. That was the thing that landed in his chest and stayed there. The room of a woman who ran a $300 million company, and there was nobody in it. She looked at him when he came in, and her expression did several things in quick succession. The involuntary relief, which she tried to cover. The pride underneath the relief, which was fighting the relief and losing. The exhaustion that was too deep to conceal it all. You didn't have to come, she said. He pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down. He'd brought green tea from the cart in the hospital lobby. He set it on the bedside table. Spinal complication? He asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You looked me up. After 9 days. I would have told you eventually. I know you would have. He leaned back in the chair. What happened? She looked at the tea, then at the ceiling, then with the resignation of someone who'd run out of energy to perform composure. Secondary nerve compression, related to the original injury. They've been monitoring it for months and it became acute. She said the word with the particular distaste of someone to whom the word had been applied against their will. It's manageable, with intervention. But the intervention requires time, and the time requires me to be here, and being here is difficult, he said. Infuriating, she said. Yeah, he nodded. What are they doing for it? She explained it in clinical terms, the way she did most things, precisely, without softening it into something more palatable. He listened. He asked a question or two that she answered with mild surprise, because they were the right questions and she hadn't expected them. My father did a lot of work around medical facilities, he said when she commented on it. Buildings. I picked things up. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing its late afternoon thing, going gray and gold at the edges. How long have you known? She asked. About Crossfield? 9 days. He paused. About everything else? Longer. I didn't know the name, but I knew the shape of it. She looked at him. And? And nothing. He picked up his own coffee. You had your reasons. I'm not owed the specifics of someone's life just because I bring them tea on a train platform. Something passed through her expression. Most people would want to know. Most people aren't me. He shrugged. You were going to tell me when you told me. You can tell me now if you want. You cannot tell me if you don't want. I'm not going anywhere either way. Evelyn Cross, who ran a company with 300 employees and who had spent 2 years learning to exist in a world that didn't build itself around her needs, and who had been sitting in this hospital room for 9 days with corporate flowers and a card she hadn't read. She pressed her lips together. And for a moment, just a moment, the composure cracked. Not dramatically, just at the edges. Her eyes went bright and she looked away quickly, toward the window and the gray-gold city outside it, and she breathed in through her nose with the controlled precision of someone who had decided a long time ago that she didn't cry in front of people. Mason didn't comment on it. He sat with his coffee and let her have the moment, and when she'd collected herself and looked back, he was just there. Terrible origami, by the way, she said. That flower you sent. I'm aware. It barely resembled a flower. It was recognizable as an attempt. Barely. He smiled. She didn't quite smile back, but her eyes did, which with Evelyn was often the more honest version anyway. Outside the window, the light was going, and the city was getting on with its evening, indifferent and relentless and full of strangers who passed each other on platforms and train cars and hospital corridors without knowing what the person beside them was carrying. Mason Reed sat in the visitor's chair in room 412 and drank his coffee. He stayed until visiting hours ended. He came back the next evening. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't texted ahead or asked whether it was convenient. He just showed up at 6:15 with green tea from the cart in the hospital lobby and a container of soup that he'd made the night before. Not hospital cafeteria soup, actual soup, the kind his neighbor, Mrs. Papadopoulos, had taught him to make during the first winter after Claire died, when he'd been living on sandwiches and cereal, and she'd shown up at his door with a pot and a look on her face that did not invite argument. Evelyn looked at the container when he set it on the bedside table, and then at him. "You cooked." "It's just vegetable soup. You cooked and brought it to a hospital. The food here is bad." "Mason." She said his name the way she sometimes did. Not sharply, but with a weight behind it, like she was using it to anchor something she wasn't sure how to say. "You have a daughter at home and a job and an actual life. You don't need to." "She's at Mrs. P's until 8. I have time." He sat down in the visitor's chair, his chair now by virtue of repetition. "Eat the soup." She looked at him for another moment with the particular expression he'd come to recognize as Evelyn losing a negotiation she wasn't sure she'd wanted to win. She reached for the container. "What's in it?" "Whatever was in my refrigerator. Carrots, celery, some kale that was almost past it. Lentils." "Lentils?" she said. "Is that a problem?" "No." She opened it. Steam came up. She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel used to say lentils were nature's apology for not making more interesting legumes." Mason smiled. "He sounds like he was terrible." "He was." She took a careful spoonful. Something moved across her face. Not a big thing, just a settling. "This is actually good." "Don't sound so surprised. She ate most of it." Aids. He drank his coffee and they talked about things that weren't the hospital. A book she'd been trying to finish before her phone died. A situation with Lily at school involving a disagreement over whose turn it was on the swings that had apparently required formal teacher mediation. A new piece of street art that had appeared on the wall of the building across from Garfield Station that Mason had noticed on his way in. It was like the train platform, but stiller. Without the crowd and the noise and the northeast wind, something that had always been slightly muffled in their conversations by the practical necessity of existing in a public space came through more clearly. He noticed things. The way she tracked the room even when she seemed focused on him, the old reflex of someone used to being in spaces where she was the decision maker. The way she sometimes started a sentence and then redirected it mid-thought, choosing a different version of what she'd been about to say, not lying, but editing, the habit of someone who'd spent years being careful about what she revealed. He noticed the corporate flowers on the windowsill were starting to droop and that nobody had replaced them. He brought Lily on the 4th visit. He'd thought about whether it was the right call for 2 days, and in the end, it was Lily who decided it without knowing she was deciding anything. He'd mentioned, carefully and without making it into a thing, that he was going to visit his friend from the train in the hospital, and Lily had looked up from her drawing and said, "The caterpillar lady?" "She hasn't weighed in on caterpillars yet. I told you." "Can I come?" "She's not feeling great." Lily considered this. Grandma says you should visit people when they're not feeling great, because that's when they need it. Mason had no counterargument for that, and Lily knew it, and that was how she ended up in room 412 on a Thursday evening, holding a drawing she'd made specifically for the occasion. She'd drawn 2 people, one sitting in what was clearly meant to be a wheelchair, rendered with the focused inaccuracy of a first grader, and something that was either flowers or an explosion in the background. He'd prepped Evelyn, at least. Texted ahead that day. Bringing someone. She made you something. Prepare for a lot of questions about caterpillars. Evelyn had texted back, "I'll do my research." When they walked in, Lily stopped just inside the door and looked at Evelyn with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. Evelyn looked back. For a moment, the two of them just regarded each other. "You're in a wheelchair," Lily said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Does it go fast? Something tugged at the corner of Evelyn's mouth. Depends on the surface. Tile is faster than carpet. Lily nodded, processing this. I made you something. She crossed the room and held out the drawing with both hands. Evelyn took it with the same seriousness with which it had been offered. She studied it. This is remarkable, she said. That's you in the chair, Lily said, pointing. And that's supposed to be Dad, but I made him too tall. And the things in the back are flowers, but they came out wrong. They look like very energetic flowers, Evelyn said. I like them better this way. Lily beamed. She climbed up onto the visitor's chair, Mason's chair, which she had immediately claimed, and tucked her feet under herself and began asking questions at the pace of someone who had been saving them up. Did the wheelchair have a name? No, said Evelyn. It didn't have a name, though that wasn't a bad idea. Did caterpillars turn into butterflies or moths or both? Both, said Evelyn, depending on the species, and Lily's eyes went wide at the information that a caterpillar could choose. She interpreted this as choice, and Mason let it go because it was close enough. Did it hurt to be in the hospital? Sometimes, said Evelyn, but mostly it was boring, and boredom was worse than pain in some ways. Lily agreed that boredom was the worst. Evelyn answered every question with full attention, not with the patient, slightly distracted quality that adults sometimes deployed when dealing with children, but actually engaged, following Lily's logic, meeting her at the level of the conversation rather than stooping to it. Mason watched this from the other visitor's chair he'd pulled in from the hallway and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. When they left, Lily took Evelyn's hand for a moment before going, unprompted, just held it briefly with the easy physical affection of a child who hadn't learned yet to meter out her warmth. Evelyn held very still while it happened, like something was moving through her that she needed not to spill. In the elevator on the way down, Lily looked up at him and said, She's lonely. He looked at her. What makes you say that? The flowers are dying and nobody fixed them. She thought about it. And she smiles like it surprises her. He didn't say anything to that. He took her hand and they walked out to the car, and the January night was cold and clear, and somewhere above the city the stars were doing what stars did, whether anyone looked at them or not. He brought fresh flowers the next day. Nothing elaborate. A bunch from the market 2 blocks from the hospital, whatever was in season, which in January wasn't much but included some yellow things he didn't know the name of and some greenery. He stuck them in the vase after quietly disposing of the corporate arrangement when Evelyn was looking at her phone. You threw away the other ones, she said without looking up. They were dead. They were sentimental. Were they? A pause. No, she admitted. They were from our VP of operations. He sent them because his assistant scheduled it. Right. Mason adjusted the yellow flowers. Better? She looked at them. Yes, she said, which cost her something, he could tell. Evelyn did not find it easy to accept things gracefully. She accepted them because she wasn't a fool, but it was effortful for her in a way it wasn't for other people. He'd started to understand why. It came out in pieces the way the real things always did. Not in any single conversation, but in the accumulation of evenings in room 412, the soup and the tea, and the drawing taped to the wall where Lily had insisted it go. The particular quiet of a hospital at 7 p.m. when the daytime bustle wound down, and it was just the two of them and the sounds of the building and the city going dark outside. She talked about the accident, not all at once, not in order, and the way trauma gets spoken about when you've been carrying it long enough that it's not a coherent narrative anymore, just weight distributed in specific places. The accident had happened at a company event. A fundraiser, she said with a particular flatness, the irony apparently still fresh even after 2 years. The car had gone off the road in wet conditions. She'd been in the back with Daniel and a colleague named Priya who'd survived with injuries that 2 years later had healed almost entirely. Daniel had not survived. She'd woken up in a hospital not entirely different from this one, and the first thing she'd understood was that she couldn't feel her legs, and the second thing she'd understood was that Daniel was gone, and she'd had to absorb both of those things simultaneously with her face because the room had been full of people, executives and board members and hospital staff. And something in her had decided in that moment that she was not going to do it in front of all those people. I waited until everyone went to get coffee, she said, which took about an hour and a half because they took turns, So there was always someone. And then finally there was a moment when the room was empty and I was alone for maybe 4 minutes. And, Mason said, and I cried. She said it without drama. And then the next person came back in and I stopped. And I don't think I've done it properly since. He thought about what she'd said on the platform months ago. Functional, which is different, and usually that's enough, and understood it now with the full context of what it was carrying. After the accident, she said, there was a period where people were present, in the way that people are when something catastrophic happens and everyone wants to be part of the response. And then slowly, she stopped. I don't know exactly when it shifted, but at some point the catastrophe became the new normal, and people went back to their lives, and I was left in mine, which was just different and smaller in the physical sense. And the ones who stayed, Mason said carefully, weren't staying for the right reasons. She glanced at him. The company needed me functional, so the people whose lives revolved around the company needed me functional. That's not the same as... She stopped again. Nobody sat with me and didn't need anything. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, he said. I know exactly what you mean. She looked at him. After Claire, he said. There were people around for a while, and then there weren't. And the ones who stuck around were good people. They were trying. But every conversation had this weight in it, like they were waiting to see if I was okay enough that they could stop worrying. Nobody just sat with me and had a regular conversation. Except, he thought about it. Mrs. P, my neighbor. She used to knock on the door and say she'd made too much food and would I take some, and then she'd stay for 20 minutes and we'd talk about nothing, the weather or what was on TV, and she never once asked me how I was doing or gave me a look like she was calculating my mental state. He shook his head. I didn't know how much I needed that until I had it. That's what you do, Evelyn said, quietly, observationally. What? You do that. You come here and you bring soup and you talk about street art and Lily's swing dispute and you don't perform concern at me. She paused. It's unusual. I'm just here, he said. I know. And the way she said it made it clear she understood exactly what that meant, what it cost in terms of time and energy and the reorganization of a life that already had enough demands on it, and that she wasn't taking it lightly, even if she couldn't quite bring herself to say so directly. The complications deepened in the second week. The nerve compression had responded to the initial intervention, but not as cleanly as the doctors had hoped, and there was a secondary issue, a word she used that Mason wrote down on his phone and looked up later, involving the specific vertebrae affected that made the recovery trajectory less straightforward than projected. They were talking about an additional procedure. They were also talking about a longer stay. He found out about this not from Evelyn, but from the level of tension he read in her when he came in that Friday. The specific set of her jaw and the way she was holding her phone screen down, like she didn't want to look at it. Bad news, he said. She looked up. They want to do a second procedure. She said it the way you said things you'd spent the last several hours trying to make peace with and hadn't quite managed. Next week, which extends the stay by at least another 10 days. He nodded. What's the procedure? She explained it. He listened. He didn't say it'll be fine or I'm sure everything will work out, because he was a man who had sat in a hospital once before being told things by doctors, and he understood that those phrases were comfort mechanisms that didn't actually comfort anyone who knew the difference. What are they giving you as a success probability? He asked. She blinked. 83% positive outcome with full intervention, compared to 61% with conservative management. So the procedure's the call, he said. Medically, yes. She looked at her hands. It's just another thing my body requires of me that I didn't plan for and can't control, and... She stopped. I'm sorry, Don't apologize. I'm not usually... She stopped again. I know you're not usually. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. You don't have to be your usual self in here. That's sort of the point of a hospital room. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to be insufferable when I'm out of here, you realize that. I'm never going to live down that you saw me like this. I'll try to be subtle about it. You're not a subtle person. That's fair. The night before the procedure, Mason came after his shift and found Evelyn sitting with the overhead light off, just the lamp on the bedside table, the yellow flowers from the market making a quiet presence against the window. She'd been looking at her phone and set it face down when he came in. "Diana called," she said. "Her sister." "How was that?" "She wanted to come. I told her not to." He sat down. He didn't immediately respond to that. "She's got her kids," Evelyn said. "It's a long flight. I'm not dying. There's no reason for her to upend her whole week." "Evelyn." "What?" "You called her?" A pause. "She called me." "You picked up?" Another pause, smaller. "Yes." "And she wanted to come and you told her not to." "The procedure is routine." "She's your sister," he said. Not harshly, just plainly. "You almost didn't tell me you were in here. You're letting your sister's flowers die. You run a company where 300 people need things from you every day, and you're sitting in this hospital room the night before a surgical procedure, and the person you love who wants to be here is on a plane you told her not to take." Evelyn was very still. "I don't know how to let people do things for me," she said. It came out flat, like a fact she'd known for a long time, and was only saying out loud because the night before a surgical procedure was not a night when she had the energy to dress it up. "I know that it looks like strength, and it isn't. I know the difference. I just don't know how to stop doing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I used to do the same thing." She looked at him. "After Claire, people would offer things, and I'd say, 'No, I'm fine. We're fine. Lily and I are fine.'" He leaned back. "We were not fine, but accepting help felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, which was that I couldn't do it alone." "Could you? Do it alone?" "No," he said simply. "Nobody can. That's not a personal failing. That's just how people work. We're not built for solo." She looked at the lamp, at the yellow flowers, at the drawing on the wall with its energetic, wrong-shaped blooms. "I asked Daniel to marry me," she said suddenly. He didn't move. "Not the other way. Me to him." Her voice had shifted into something slower, more careful. "We'd been together 4 years, and he was the kind of person who waited, who didn't push. He'd have waited another 4 years if I needed it." She paused. "I asked him on a Tuesday. We were just having dinner in our apartment. Nothing special, pasta, bad TV. And I just asked him." "What did he say?" The corner of her mouth moved. "He cried," which was not what I expected from a man who was usually extremely composed. He cried, and then he laughed at himself for crying, and then he said yes, and then he spilled his wine. A pause. "We didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks because I wasn't ready for it to be public yet. It was just ours for 2 weeks. And then the accident, 4 months later." He didn't say anything. Some things didn't benefit from commentary. "I never wear the ring," she said. "I have it. It's in a box at home. I've thought about, I don't know, wearing it or not wearing it both feel wrong, so I don't do either. I just leave it in the box." She looked down at her bare left hand. "That probably sounds like someone doing their best with something impossible," Mason said. She looked at him. Her eyes were doing the bright thing again, the thing she controlled by looking away, and this time she didn't immediately look away. "I don't know what I would have done," she said quietly. "These last few weeks, if you—" She stopped. "I'm not good at this part. I know. I'm working on it. I know that too." She pressed her lips together. "The soup helped," she said finally. "I want you to know that. The soup specifically." He nodded, serious. "I'll pass that along to the lentils." She exhaled through her nose in the thing that wasn't quite a laugh, but functioned as one. He stayed another hour. They talked about smaller things, the progress of the caterpillar situation, which Lily had been updating him on daily, a documentary Evelyn had been watching on her laptop in the slow hours of the night, the seam on Platform 7 that he'd complained to the station management about twice without any action taken. At 8:15 he stood to go. She said, "Mason." He stopped. "Call Diana, shit," he said. before she could say what she'd been about to say. Tell her the procedures tomorrow. Let her decide whether she comes. Evelyn looked at him with the expression of someone who had been preparing a different response and found it no longer applicable. That's not what I was going to say. I know, but do it anyway. She exhaled. Fine, she said, with an effort that was visible but real. He put on his jacket. At the door he paused and looked back at her in the lamplight with the drawing on the wall and the yellow flowers and the phone in her lap that she would, he was fairly sure, pick up in the next 10 minutes. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you've got people. She held his gaze for a second longer than she had to. I know, she said. He went out into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed and stood there for a moment in the fluorescent corridor light and breathed. The procedure was scheduled for 7 the next morning. He'd arranged to have the afternoon off. His supervisor, a practical man named Gerald, who'd lost his own wife to cancer 3 years back, and understood without requiring explanation when Mason said he needed to be somewhere, and he was in the waiting area outside pre-op by 9 a.m., with coffee he didn't really taste and a book he didn't open. Diana Cross arrived at 9:47. He knew her immediately. She had Evelyn's dark hair, shorter, and the same quality of assessment in her eyes, though hers was warmer, less guarded. She scanned the waiting room and her gaze landed on him, and she crossed over. You're Mason, she said. Yeah. She told you not to come, didn't she? She didn't tell me anything. She doesn't know I'm here. Diana looked at him for a moment. She looked like she was processing the information and recalibrating something. She told me about you, she said. On the phone last night. She was trying to sound like she was just providing information, but she's not as subtle as she thinks she is. What did she say? She said, and I'm quoting, that there was a person from her train who'd been bringing her soup and that it was unnecessary, but the lentils were above average. He almost smiled. High praise, Diana said. And then, settling into the chair beside him, she hasn't let anyone bring her soup in 2 years, in case you were wondering whether it meant something. He looked at his coffee cup. I wasn't wondering, he said, which was not entirely true, but was close enough. They sat in the waiting room, the sister and the man from the train, while the city went about its morning outside the hospital windows, indifferent and continuous, and the hours passed the way they do when you're waiting for news, slowly, then all at once. The surgeon came out at 11:43. Positive outcome. Procedure went as planned. She'd be in recovery for a couple of hours and they could see her after that. Diana let out a breath that had clearly been held since she'd walked off that plane. She covered her face with both hands for a second and then pulled them down and looked at Mason with her sister's eyes, dark and direct. Okay, she said. Yeah, he said. They sat back in their chairs. On the other side of the window, winter light was doing its thin January thing, pale and insufficient and present. Mason thought about a train platform in October, a woman with a caught wheelchair wheel and dark eyes that had decided in about 10 seconds whether he was trustworthy. A paper flower he still had on his kitchen counter, gone soft at the edges. He thought about what Diana had said. She hasn't let anyone bring her soup in 2 years. He didn't examine what he felt about that too closely. He wasn't ready to look at it straight yet. He just sat with it the way you sit with something you know is going to matter, while the winter light came through the hospital windows and the hours finished their slow unspooling. When they let him into the recovery room at 2:15, Evelyn was awake but hazy, the particular underwater quality of a person coming up from anesthesia. She looked at him when he came in, and then at Diana, and something crossed her face that he'd remember later. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of someone who had been braced for one version of a moment and had gotten a different, better one instead. You called her, she said, directed at Mason. Her voice was rougher than usual, slower. You told me to. I told you to let her decide. She decided. Evelyn looked at her sister. Diana was already holding her hand, already talking in a low voice, already doing the thing that sisters do when they've been kept at a distance by the person they love and are refusing to be kept anymore. Mason stayed near the door. This part wasn't his. He understood that. But before he slipped out, Evelyn's eyes found him over her sister's shoulder. She didn't say anything, neither did he. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in it was something she hadn't worked out how to say yet, and he knew she hadn't worked it out, and he was willing to wait however long it took. He went out into the corridor and pulled the door gently closed. He made it to the elevator before he let himself feel the full weight of the last hour. The waiting, the surgeon's words, the pale winter light, the look on her face when she'd seen them both standing there. He pressed the button. He went home to his daughter, who had made a new drawing for Evelyn and wanted to know every detail of how the flowers were holding up. Diana stayed for 5 days. Mason knew this because Evelyn mentioned it on the first evening he visited after the procedure, when Evelyn was still slow-voiced from the recovery, and Diana had stepped out to find coffee, and it was just the two of them in the room with the fresh flowers he'd brought, yellow again because they'd worked the first time. "She's staying through Thursday," Evelyn said. Not unhappily, in the careful tone of someone who was still adjusting to having been caught wanting something they'd told themselves they didn't need. "Good," Mason said. "She rearranged her whole week. She's your sister. That's what sisters do." Evelyn looked at the flowers. "She reorganized my bedside table. She brought me 3 books I didn't ask for, and one of them is actually good. She argued with the floor nurse about the heating in here for 20 minutes and won." A pause. "She's exhausting." "You love her." "Completely," Evelyn said, simply, without the usual qualifying layer of dryness, just completely. Diana, for her part, had pulled Mason aside that first evening in the corridor outside room 412, while Evelyn was being checked on by the attending physician, and she'd said without preamble that she was glad he existed. Not in a sentimental way. She'd said it the way someone states a logistical fact they've confirmed and can now move on from. He'd said he was glad to hear it, and she'd said she meant it, and then the doctor had come out and they'd both gone back in, and that had been that. The recovery was not clean. He'd known enough about the medical situation by then to not expect clean, and the second week bore that out. There were 2 days where the pain management wasn't adequate, and Evelyn was short with everyone, and then apologetic about being short, which was its own kind of suffering for her. There was a night where the secondary complication the doctors had flagged showed some movement in the wrong direction, and there were tense hours and additional imaging and a conversation with a specialist that Mason was not in the room for, but that he could read in its entirety in the set of Evelyn's face when he arrived the next morning. "They're adjusting the protocol," she said. Flat, controlled. And it should work, should. She said the word like it had sharp edges. "I'm very tired of should." "I know. I had a board meeting scheduled for next week, quarterly review. My CFO is handling it, but..." She stopped. "I know it doesn't matter. I know it's just a meeting. I just feel like the company is this..." She made a gesture with one hand, something between a grip and a release. "I built it. I built most of it from the ground up, before the accident, and even after. Even from a wheelchair, and it's the thing that I..." Another stop. "It's one of the only things that never changed on me. After everything. The company was still the company." He understood what she was really saying, which was that when everything else had been taken, her mobility, Daniel, the version of her future she'd planned, the work had been the fixed point, the thing that required her, and in requiring her, had kept her moving. "Nobody's taking the company from you," he said. "I know that rationally. But it doesn't feel rational when you're lying here." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He stayed 2 hours. Before he left, he told her Gerald had given him flexible hours for the next couple of weeks, which was a reorganization of the truth. Gerald had given him the flexibility because Mason had asked for it directly. And Gerald was the kind of man who said yes to things that mattered without making them into negotiations. Evelyn looked at him when he said this. "You asked your supervisor for flexibility." He was fine with it. "Mason, you do the same." "I don't..." She stopped, started again. "I run a company. I have the structural ability to..." "You'd find a way to do it," he said. "If someone you..." He paused for a fraction of a second. "If someone needed you, you'd find a way." She held his gaze. Something in the pause registered. He could see it, but she let it go. "Thank you," she said, quietly and directly, which for Evelyn was the equivalent of a significant gesture from anyone else. Diana left on Thursday, as scheduled. She hugged Evelyn for a long time before going, the way siblings hug when they've been reminded of something they'd started to take for granted, and she pressed her cheek against Evelyn's hair and said something too low for Mason to hear, and Evelyn said something back, and then Diana pulled away and looked at her sister and nodded once like something had been confirmed. On her way out, she stopped beside Mason in the corridor. "Call me if anything shifts," she said. "I don't care what time." "I will." She studied him for a moment. "She doesn't know what to do with you." "I'm aware." "That's not a bad thing," Diana said. "She knows what to do with everything. It's one of her problems." She pulled on her coat. "You're good for her. I'm telling you that as someone who has been paying close attention for 30 years. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and Diana gave him a look that suggested she'd expected exactly that response and found it acceptable. She left. He went back into room 412. Evelyn was looking out the window at the February sky, which was the color of old concrete. "She likes you," Evelyn said. "She's easy to like in return." "She said almost exactly the same thing about you." Evelyn turned from the window. "She's not usually like that with people she's just met." "Neither are you," he said. She looked at him. He hadn't planned to say that. It had come out with the directness of something that had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. The air in the room shifted by about 2 degrees. "No," she said after a moment. "I'm not." Neither of them said anything else about it. He sat down. She reached for the book Diana had left, the good one, and he pulled out his own phone, and they existed in the room together in the specific comfortable silence that you only arrive at with people you've accumulated real time with. He thought about what Diana had said in the corridor. "She doesn't know what to do with you." He understood that. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with himself either, with respect to Evelyn Cross and the feelings he'd been managing like a slow-building pressure that he kept his hand flat against and didn't push. He knew what they were. He'd known for a while. He was 33 years old, and he had lost the woman he'd loved completely, and had spent 6 years grieving her and raising her daughter and being, above all things, careful. Careful with himself, careful with Lily, careful about what he let himself want, because wanting things had a cost, and he'd already paid costs he hadn't planned for. But this was what it was, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise to himself, even if he wasn't ready to say it out loud. Evelyn was discharged on a Thursday in late February, 23 days after the procedure. She'd had the company send a car, which she'd told Mason about in advance, in a tone that suggested she was explaining a purely logistical decision, and he should interpret it as nothing more than that. He'd said that made sense and shown up anyway at the discharge desk at 10 a.m., because by now they both understood the pattern. "You're not taking the car," she said when she saw him. "I brought my truck." "It has a running board," she said. "I can't. I brought a portable ramp." He said it without inflection. "I looked up the measurements." She stared at him. "It's a 20-minute drive," he said, "in a car that isn't going to smell like corporate air freshener." A very long pause. "Fine," she said. Getting her into the truck was not graceful. The ramp worked, but the angle was awkward, and there was a moment of logistical difficulty that required clear communication and some adjustment, and a brief instance of Evelyn saying, "That's not, no, the other side," with the particular sharpness of someone who did not enjoy requiring assistance and was not going to pretend otherwise. He didn't comment on the sharpness. He just shifted his grip, and they figured it out. Once she was in and the chair was in the bed and they were moving, she looked out the passenger window at the city going past, bare trees and February streets, and the familiar blocks she hadn't seen in 3 weeks. And he watched her from the corner of his eye watching it, and the expression on her face was the closest thing to unguarded he'd ever seen from her. "Okay?" he said. "It's just good to be out," she said. Quietly. He drove. She lived in a building that was not what he'd expected, which was to say it was less aggressive about its own money than he'd have guessed for a CEO who ran a $300 million company. The building was good, doorman, accessible entrance, clearly well-maintained, but it wasn't showy. It had the quality of a place someone had chosen because it worked for their life, not because it made a statement about them. The doorman, a man in his 60s named Felix, who greeted Evelyn with genuine warmth and no pity whatsoever, held the door and helped with the chair with the ease of someone who'd done it many times. She thanked him by name. He said it was good to have her back and meant it. Her apartment was on the 8th floor. It was large enough that the wheelchair had real room to move, and he understood she'd thought about that when she'd chosen it. The windows faced west. Sunsets, he said. She glanced at him. Obviously. He helped her get situated, a phrase that covered 20 minutes of practical management that she directed with precise instructions and he executed without editorializing, because this was not a moment for anything other than competent assistance. When it was done and she was at her own kitchen table with her own things around her, some of the held tension in her body released in a way he could visibly see. "Better," she said, more to herself than to him. He made tea. Her kitchen was organized in a way that made sense for someone who moved through it in a wheelchair. Lower shelves, clear pathways, everything within reach. He found the tea without asking because the organization was logical and he'd been paying attention. He set the cup in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "I want to do something," she said. He sat down across from her. "Okay." "While I was in there, in the hospital, I kept thinking about..." She stopped, organized her thoughts, started again. "You told me once that after Claire, strangers carried you through, people who didn't owe you anything." "Yeah. I've been thinking about what that means, being carried by people who didn't have to." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I have money. I have more than I need, which is... It's not something I say without knowing what it means. I know what it means to have more than you need. And for 2 years I've been putting it into the company, into growth, into the next thing, because the next thing was the only direction I knew how to move." He was listening. "There are kids," she said. "Kids who need wheelchairs and don't have them. Kids who need prosthetics and can't afford them. Kids who need rehabilitation therapy and the wait lists are..." She stopped. "I looked into it when I was in the hospital, 12, 14 months on some of the pediatric rehab wait lists in this city, for kids who are ready to make progress right now, today, and they're waiting 14 months. Her jaw was set in the way it got when something had made her genuinely angry. "That's not a resource problem. That's a priority problem." He thought about Lily, about her ease in the room with Evelyn, her uncomplicated acceptance, her question, "Does it go fast?" about the wheelchair, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to ask. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I want to fund a rehabilitation center. A real one, not a wing, not a grant. A dedicated pediatric facility with equipment and staff and no 14-month wait lists." She said it the way she said things she'd already decided. "I can fund the infrastructure, but I don't want it to be a corporate vanity project. I don't want it to be Evelyn Cross puts her name on a building. That's not..." She looked frustrated with herself for not having the right words. "I want it to mean something to the people it serves." "What does that look like?" he said. "I don't know yet." She met his eyes. "That's why I'm talking to you." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You'd need community buy-in," he said. "People who trust it because someone they know vouches for it, not because a company sent a press release." "Yes." "And you'd need a way to introduce it. Build visibility the right way through people rather than advertising." "Yes." She was watching him. "You know people." "I know my neighborhood," he said, "which is not the same as knowing people in any useful..." "Mason." She said it with a directness that stopped him. "You are someone people trust. I've watched you for months. The way your supervisor covered for you without you having to explain yourself. The way your neighbor watches Lily without it being a transaction. That doesn't happen by accident. That's a person who has built something over years without meaning to." She paused. "I can put money into this. You can put that." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a community center," he said slowly, "on Marsh Street. They do events. The woman who runs it, Patricia, she's been there 15 years. People actually show up to things she organizes because she doesn't oversell them. That's the kind of person I need to talk to. She's going to ask you why. I'll tell her why. The whole why, not the PR version." Evelyn held his gaze. The whole why, she said. He nodded. He believed her. The fundraiser took 3 months to come together, which was faster than it should have been and slower than Evelyn wanted, which was pretty much how all projects went when you combined her drive with actual logistical reality. Mason introduced her to Patricia at the Marsh Street Community Center on a Thursday afternoon in early March, 2 weeks after Evelyn's discharge, and the meeting lasted 2.5 hours, which Mason had predicted and Evelyn had not. Patricia was 64, black, had run the community center since her mid-40s after a career in social work, and had exactly zero patience for anything that felt like a photo opportunity disguised as charity. She sat across from Evelyn in her office, a small room with a window that faced an alley and a desk covered in organized stacks of paper, and she listened to Evelyn lay out the rehabilitation center concept, and then she asked 3 questions. 1, who was this for, really? 2, what did she want in return? 3, why now? Evelyn answered all 3 without the PR version. She said it was for the kids on the 14-month wait list, and she wanted the community involved in designing it, so it actually served their needs rather than what she assumed their needs were. She said she wanted to build something that worked, and she wanted her name nowhere on the building because she wasn't doing it for her name. And she said, why now? And the why now was honest in a way that cost her something. She talked about the hospital and the flowers that nobody replaced, and a man who brought soup when he didn't have to, and what it meant to be carried by people who owed you nothing, and what it made her want to do with what she had. Patricia listened to all of it. She looked at Evelyn, and then at Mason, and then back at Evelyn. The event, she said. We'll co-host it. My building, my community contacts, your funding, but I lead the outreach. Agreed, Evelyn said. And I need access to your planning process. I'm not a rubber stamp. I don't want a rubber stamp, Evelyn said. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong. Patricia considered her for another moment. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod when they've made a decision they're prepared to stand behind. All right, she said, let's build something. The planning was not smooth. Nothing real ever was. There were disagreements between Patricia's community-led approach and Evelyn's structural instincts. Evelyn wanted timelines and deliverables, and Patricia wanted consensus building that didn't run on timelines. And they argued about it in the kind of direct, non-destructive way that 2 strong-willed people can argue when they both want the same outcome. Mason mediated occasionally, which mostly involved letting both of them talk and then pointing out where they'd said the same thing in different vocabularies. He'd taken on the practical coordination, the venue setup, the logistics, the communication with local businesses about donation matching. He did it around his work schedule, in evenings after Lily was down, on weekends when Mrs. P took Lily to the park. He was tired in the familiar way of someone running slightly past their capacity, but it was a different kind of tired than the bone-deep grief tired of the years before. This tired had a direction to it. It was going somewhere. Lily knew about the fundraiser in the way she knew about everything that happened in Mason's orbit. She absorbed it through proximity. She heard the phone calls, she saw the spreadsheets. She asked questions and accepted answers, and then asked follow-up questions that were somehow better than the originals. The kids need wheelchairs, she said one evening, watching Mason on his laptop at the kitchen table. Some of them, or other things, special equipment to help them do physical therapy. Like what Evelyn needs? Sort of. Different kids need different things. Lily was quiet for a moment. Does it cost a lot? Yeah, it costs a lot. How much is Evelyn giving? A lot, he said. More than I'll ever have. Lily thought about this with the visible effort of a 7-year-old processing scale. Is that why you're helping? Because she has the money part but needs help with the other parts? He looked at her. Where did you get that? She shrugged. You always say some people have money, and some people have time, and some people have how to do things. And when you put them together, you can do more than any one person. He had said that. He'd said it once, months ago, in the context of explaining why he volunteered sometimes to help the building super with repairs that the man couldn't quite manage alone. He hadn't realized she'd kept it. Yeah, he said. That's basically it. She went back to her drawing, after a moment. I could make pictures. For the kids who come. So the room is nicer. He looked at her profile. The small, serious face, the way she held her crayon with her whole fist the way young children did. Claire's eyes, his stubborn set to the jaw. "I think that's a great idea," he said. She made 11 drawings over the course of the next 2 weeks. Evelyn, when Mason brought them in a folder to show her one afternoon at Crossfield's offices, Evelyn had been back at work for 6 weeks by then, operating at what she called 70%, which Mason suspected was other people's 110, spread them out on her desk and looked at each one. "The flowers are still energetic," she said. "It's her signature style." Evelyn looked at the drawings for a long moment. There was something in her face he'd learned to read, the thing that happened when she was moved by something and was managing the movement rather than expressing it. He'd gotten better at letting it pass without commenting. "We should frame them," she said, "for the center. Actual frames, properly hung. She'll want to know where they go." "We'll bring her when we open." Evelyn looked up. "If that's all right." She'd love that. They held each other's eyes for a moment too long to be purely logistical. It kept happening like that, these moments that had a quality of almost to them, like standing at a threshold without quite stepping through. The fundraiser was on a Saturday in April. Patricia had titled it "Moving Forward Together," which was direct enough to not be corny and specific enough to mean something. The Marsh Street Community Center had a main hall that could hold 200 people if you didn't mind being comfortable rather than comfortable, and they'd set it up with round tables and a small stage and a display of information about the proposed pediatric rehabilitation center, including architectural renderings that Evelyn had commissioned from an accessibility-specialized design firm. Mason arrived at 7 a.m. to help with setup. He moved tables and ran extension cords and argued pleasantly with Patricia about where the donation station should go, and she was right about the placement, and he said so, and she gave him the look of someone who respected a person who admitted when they were wrong. By 5 p.m., an hour before doors opened, the hall looked like what they'd hoped for: warm, functional, real. No corporate sheen. Lily's drawings were framed and hung along one wall in a loose grouping that the woman from the design firm had arranged, and that looked somehow exactly right. The yellow flowers that had become a kind of running motif between Mason and Evelyn were in low vases on every table. He hadn't planned the flowers consciously, he just ordered them, and then noticed what he'd done and chosen not to analyze it. Evelyn arrived at 5:30, which was earlier than she'd said, and he suspected she'd been too restless to wait. She was in a dark blazer over a simple shirt, her hair loose the way it had been in the hospital, and she wheeled herself through the entrance and stopped just inside the door and looked at the hall. He watched her look at it. "Patricia did most of the layout," he said. "I know, but you did the flowers. They work." "They do." She turned from the room to look at him. "It looks like something that means it." "That's because it does." The doors opened at 6. For the first 40 minutes, attendance was what it was. Modest, steady, the kind of turnout that made you run calculations in your head about whether the goal was reachable. Patricia moved through the room with the ease of someone who'd been building this community for 15 years, her hand on an arm here, a name remembered there, drawing people into conversations with the skill of someone who understood that connection happened in small moments, not announcements. And then the room shifted. It happened the way these things happen when they worked, not with a single dramatic arrival, but with a gradual density, a warmth that built as the hall filled. Mason saw faces he recognized: his upstairs neighbor, his former coworker Denny, who'd done 4 blocks of outreach without being asked, the pharmacist from the corner 2 streets from his apartment building, who'd hung flyers in his window, and apparently then personally told every customer about it. He saw families with children in wheelchairs and families without. He saw teachers from Lily's school, and he saw doctors, and he saw the woman from the tea cart at Garfield Station, which stopped him cold for a moment because he hadn't told her about the event, and she must have found out through someone else entirely. He found Evelyn at one of the tables, deep in conversation with a woman whose daughter, maybe 9, maybe 10, sat beside her in a bright blue wheelchair. The girl had the specific quality of attention that children direct at people they find genuinely interesting, leaned slightly forward, eyes on Evelyn's face. He didn't interrupt. He watched from a distance. Evelyn was talking to the girl directly, not to the mother, and whatever she was saying had the girl's complete focus. He saw the girl say something and Evelyn respond, and then they both looked at the girl's wheelchair, and Evelyn gestured at her own and said something that made the girl tip her head back and laugh. He had to look away from that. The feeling in his chest was something he could no longer reasonably pretend was just care for a friend. Patricia's remarks were short and clear. Evelyn spoke for 4 minutes and said more in those 4 minutes than most people said in 20, because she'd decided to tell the truth about the hospital, about the wait lists, about what it meant to need something and not be able to access it through no fault of your own. She didn't mention Daniel. She didn't mention Mason. She didn't mention her own disability, except in the context of understanding what these families navigated every day. She spoke like someone who was not trying to impress anyone and consequently impressed everyone. By 9 o'clock, the donation total was on the screen at the front of the hall, updated in real time by Patricia's nephew, who handled the technical side, and it was more than double the goal they'd set. Mason was standing near the back of the room when Evelyn found him, threading through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd stopped negotiating her chair around people and had started expecting people to make room, which they did. She stopped beside him, and they looked at the number on the screen. "Patricia's going to be insufferable," Evelyn said. "She earned it." She absolutely did. A beat. "The tea cart woman's here. I saw." "You didn't tell her." "I didn't." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "You have no idea, do you?" "About what?" She looked at him sideways. "About what you've built in this neighborhood, without noticing you were doing it." He looked at the room. The conversation still going, the donations still coming, Lily's drawings on the wall catching the light, the girl in the blue wheelchair now showing Evelyn's card to her mother, the tea cart woman laughing at something Patricia had said, his old co-worker Denny with a paper plate of food in one hand and a donated check in the other. Claire would have loved this, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It was just true. He felt rather than saw Evelyn go still beside him. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Not the loss. Her." He was quiet for a moment. "She was loud," he said. "Not in a bad way. She just took up space in every room she was in. She thought most rules were suggestions. She burned food constantly and didn't care because she said the first batch was always a test run anyway." He paused. "She would have walked in here tonight and known everyone's name by the end of it, and meant it. She never met a stranger." "Lily has that," Evelyn said softly. "Yeah," he said. "She does." They stood in the warmth of the room, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and around them the evening continued its work. Money raised, children considered, a future being built with the combined resources of someone who had more than enough and a neighborhood that had more than it knew. The girl in the blue wheelchair had found Lily's drawings on the wall. Mason noticed it first. The girl parked in front of the framed collection, her head tilted, reading the small card that said, "Drawn by Lily Reed, age 7, that someone, he didn't know who, had placed beneath them. The girl raised her hand and pointed at one of the energetic, wrong-shaped flowers, and said something to her mother, and the mother looked and smiled. He nudged Evelyn gently. She looked. She saw it. She didn't say anything, but her hand, resting on the armrest of her chair, moved a few inches until the back of her fingers rested against the side of his hand. He didn't move his hand. Neither did she. They stood like that for a moment that was small and significant and not ready to be anything more yet, while across the room a child in a blue wheelchair pointed at a drawing made by another child who had learned, from the example of the adults around her, that the best thing you could do with what you had was give some of it away. The number on the screen climbed. Patricia caught Mason's eye from across the room and raised her chin once, the particular nod of someone who has seen something they needed to see. He nodded back. Outside, April was doing its uncertain thing. Too warm for winter, not yet committed to spring. The city in that transitional state where you never quite knew what coat you needed. But inside the Marsh Street Community Center on a Saturday evening, something that had started with a caught wheelchair wheel on a train platform and a paper flower and a cup of green tea had become something neither of them had planned, and both of them now could see clearly. It wasn't finished. It was just beginning, which was a different and more demanding thing. But beginnings, Mason Reed had learned in the hardest possible way, were the only things that led anywhere worth going. He left his hand where it was. She left hers where it was. The room carried on around them, warm and imperfect and full of people doing what people did when someone gave them the chance to be better than they'd remembered they could be. The morning after the fundraiser, Mason woke up at 5:50 before his alarm and lay in the dark for a few minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for him. He was a man who got up when he woke up, who didn't linger, who had trained himself out of the habit of lying still because lying still in the early years after Claire had been an invitation to a particular kind of grief that arrived with the silence and didn't leave quickly. But this morning, the lying still felt different, not heavy, just full. Like something that had been hollow for a long time had something in it now, and he was taking stock of the new weight. He thought about her hand against his, the back of her fingers resting there, neither of them moving. He got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the city went gray to pink outside, and he thought about what it meant to want something again after a long time of not letting himself. It wasn't simple. It was never going to be simple. There was Lily to think about, and there was Claire. Not as a prohibition, not as a ghost standing between him and anything, but as a presence he carried and would always carry, the way you carried people who'd shaped the entire structure of who you became. There was the fact that Evelyn was still Evelyn, still the woman who'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of needing no one, who ran a company with the focused intensity of someone who'd decided work was the fixed point when everything else moved. None of that was uncomplicated. He knew that. But he also knew that the complicated thing was the real thing, and the real thing was worth more than the comfortable version of his life, where he kept his feelings neatly inside the category of friendship, because that was safer and required less of him. He was 33 years old. He was tired of safe. He texted her at 7:15, just, "Good morning, how's the hand?" He meant her right hand, which had been cramping in the weeks since the procedure. A side effect of the nerve work, something the physical therapist was addressing. He'd started asking about it the way you asked about things that mattered to you without making them into declarations. She responded 11 minutes later, which for Evelyn on a Sunday morning was practically immediate, manageable. Patricia's already sent 3 texts. It's 7 in the morning. He smiled at his phone. What does she want? Follow-up meeting, media coverage, a planning committee. She's built an entire organizational structure overnight. You love it. A pause. Then, I'm not going to confirm that. He took Lily to the park that afternoon, the one 3 blocks from their building with the climbing structure she'd mostly outgrown, but still used on the grounds that it was hers by history. She climbed, and he sat on the bench and watched her. And after a while she came and sat beside him with the comfortable disregard for personal space that children had with the people they were completely secure with, leaning against his arm. "Is Evelyn your girlfriend?" she said. He looked at her. She was watching a pigeon negotiate a pretzel. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you look at her like you looked at the truck before you bought it, like you want it but you're not sure if it's a good idea." He thought about this. That is a remarkably specific observation. Mrs. P says you overthink things. Mrs. P talks too much. Lily looked up at him with Claire's eyes. "Do you like her?" He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Yeah," he said. "I do." "Does she like you?" "I think so. It's complicated." Lily considered this with the focused pragmatism of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to find complexity romantic. "You should just tell her," she said, "because then you know." "It's not always that simple." "Why?" He didn't have a good answer for that, or rather he had several answers, but none of them would have survived contact with a 7-year-old's directness. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and the pigeon claimed the pretzel, and the afternoon went about its business around them. He told her 3 weeks later. Not in a grand way. There was no planned moment, no setting designed for the purpose. It happened on a Tuesday evening in Evelyn's apartment. He'd come for dinner, which had become a thing that happened once or twice a week, him cooking in her kitchen while she worked at the table, and they talked through the wall of cabinets, the domestic rhythm of it so natural that neither of them had commented on how natural it was. He'd made pasta, the real kind, not the jarred sauce version he made on school nights. And they'd eaten at her table with the west-facing windows going orange and gold behind her, the kind of sunset she used to catalog from train windows. After dinner, she was looking at something on her laptop, some quarterly report that she'd been annotating, and he was washing up at the sink, and the silence between them was the familiar, comfortable kind. And then she said, without looking up from the screen, "The board wants me to give a keynote at the Infrastructure Summit in September. Will you do it?" "Probably. It's useful exposure for the Rehabilitation Center initiative." She scrolled something. "I'd need someone to come with me. The venue's not—" She stopped. Started again, more precisely. "The accessibility situation at the venue is manageable, but I'd want someone who knew the layout in advance." He turned off the water. He turned around. She was still looking at the laptop screen, but her scrolling had stopped. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm asking if you'd be available in September," she said to the screen. "You're asking me to come with you to a conference. As a practical, you have an accessibility coordinator at Crossfield," he said. "I've met her. She's excellent." The typing stopped. He came and sat across from her at the table. She looked up from the laptop. She had the expression she wore when she'd lost a negotiation she'd known she was going to lose and was deciding how to handle it. "I know," she said. "So." She closed the laptop, carefully, the way she did things when she was buying herself a moment to get the words in order. He waited. "This is—" She stopped. "I have not done this, whatever this is, since Daniel. I haven't wanted to." She was looking at the table, then made herself look up, made herself hold eye contact because she was not someone who looked away from difficult things, even when the difficult thing was her own feelings. "I don't know how to do it without being afraid that it disappears." "Yeah," he said. "I know that feeling." "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," he said, which was true, and he said it plainly. "I haven't—" He exhaled. 6 years. I haven't looked at anyone the way I look at you, and I'm aware it's a lot to say out loud, and I'm going to say it anyway because I'm done doing the thing where I pretend it's something smaller than it is." She was very still. "I don't know what this looks like," he said. "I have a daughter and a job and a truck with a ramp in the bed, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment that smells like coffee and whatever Lily was drawing with most recently. That's what I have. And I know that's not—" "Mason," she said, "I'm not finished." She pressed her lips together. He could see her working not to say something. "I know that's not—" He stopped, regrouped. "I'm not asking you to fold yourself into my life. I'm not asking anything yet. I'm just telling you what's true for me, because you deserve to know it. And I'm tired of being careful about it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sunset was doing the thing she used to track from train windows, the specific quality of light that she'd once described as the kind that made you feel like you were being reminded of something you'd almost forgotten. "The grocery list," she said. He looked at her, not sure where she was going. "You told me about Claire's grocery list, that you kept it because it was in her handwriting." She met his eyes. "I still have Daniel's voice on an old voicemail. I haven't been able to delete it. It's from before the accident. He's calling to tell me he's running late. It's completely ordinary, 20 seconds. She paused. "I listen to it sometimes. Not often, but sometimes." "Okay," he said. He meant it as, "I understand. I'm not asking you to not have that." "I need you to know it exists," she said, "because I can't be someone who doesn't have that. That's part of what I am. I have a 6-year-old who looks exactly like a woman I loved completely, and it's the best thing about my day and the hardest thing about my day simultaneously," he said. "We both get to be whole people." Something in her face settled. Not a release of tension, more like a resolution. The particular expression of someone who has been holding themselves very carefully for a very long time and has located in front of them a thing solid enough to lean against. "I would like to go to the conference," she said, "in September, with you." He almost smiled. "That's what we're calling it. That's what I'm calling it." But her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was actually happy and hadn't quite decided to admit it yet. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand. She put hers in it. It wasn't simple. He'd known it wasn't going to be, and he was right. The weeks that followed had all the friction of two people who'd been running their lives independently for years, trying to figure out how to exist in the same orbit without losing what made them who they were. There were evenings when Evelyn worked until 10 p.m., And Mason was already asleep, and she'd text him when she finished with something dry and brief, and he'd respond in the morning, and they'd both accept the gap as part of the geometry. There were days when his schedule collapsed because of an emergency job and he'd have to cancel plans, and she'd say it was fine and mean it, which he'd learned to trust even when the old part of him braced for it to not be fine. There were hard conversations, the kind you couldn't shortcut. One night in June, she told him about the 3 months after the accident when she'd refused physical therapy. Not refused gently, refused completely, told the hospital to discharge her occupational therapist, ran her company from a wheelchair she didn't yet know how to navigate, and let nobody help her with anything, because helping felt like being seen in a state she couldn't accept. She'd lost 8 weeks of recovery progress that she'd spent the following year clawing back. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because it's the worst version of what I did," she said, "and you should know the worst version." "Evelyn, I'm not great at graceful," she said. "I know how to be competent, and I know how to be composed, and I know how to be strategic, but when something breaks me open, I tend to—" She made the gesture again, the one that was between a grip and a release. "I close. I know I do it. I'm telling you so you know to push. You want me to push. Within reason. A beat. Don't make it insufferable." "I'll try to be a tasteful amount of insufferable," he said. "That is not reassuring." He told her about the months when he'd started leaving cabinet doors open. He told her about it before, on the train platform, but he told her more of it now. The full version, including the part where one morning Lily, 3 years old at the time, had woken up and found him standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the open cabinet doors, and she'd walked in and looked at him and said, in the way of a 3-year-old who didn't know she was saying something significant, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And he'd said, "Just checking something." And she'd said, "Okay," and held up her arms to be picked up, and he'd picked her up and stood there in the kitchen at 2 in the morning holding his daughter and finally cried, properly, for the first time since Claire had died, standing in front of the open cabinet doors. Evelyn listened to all of it. "After that," he said, "it got a little better. Not a lot. A little." "Lily saved you," she said. "We saved each other," he said. "That's how it works with kids. You think you're doing everything for them, and it turns out they're doing half of it for you." She was quiet for a moment. There was something on her face he hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen directed at him quite this specifically. It was the expression of someone encountering something they want. "I'm a little afraid of being a person in her life," she said. "In Lily's. I don't want to—" She chose her words carefully. "I don't want to be someone she attaches to and then loses." "I understand that," he said. "So I need us to be careful about that specifically." "We will be." "I mean it, Mason. She's 7. "I know how old my daughter is," he said, not sharply, "and I'm not asking you to be her mother or to step into anything before it's ready. But you're already in her life. That happened." He paused. "She talks about you. She drew you 11 pictures. She has opinions about your wheelchair's speed rating." Evelyn exhaled through her nose. "Only on tile." "Right." She looked at him. "I just don't want to do it wrong." "We're going to do parts of it wrong," he said. "That's unavoidable. The goal isn't not doing it wrong. The goal is still being there after the parts that go wrong." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. The rehabilitation center broke ground in October, 13 months after the fundraiser. It was a real groundbreaking, not a ceremonial shovel moment for press photos, but actual construction beginning on a building that Evelyn had personally overseen the design of with the accessibility firm and Patricia's community advisory board, a process that had involved 17 meetings, 4 rounds of revision, 2 significant disagreements about the therapy pool placement, and 1 heated argument in Patricia's office that had ended with Evelyn admitting Patricia was right about the community room location and Patricia buying them both coffee in acknowledgement. Mason had gone to most of the meetings. Not all. Some were Evelyn's domain, the structural and financial ones where his presence would have been logistically unnecessary. But the community-facing ones, the ones where families came to give input on what the center needed to actually serve them, he was there. He'd become, somewhere in the year that had passed, the person those families talked to after the official meeting ended. Not because he'd planned it, just because he was the kind of person who asked follow-up questions and remembered the answers, Who knew that the mother of the girl in the blue wheelchair was named Rosa, and that the girl's name was Carmen, and that Carmen had recently become interested in adaptive swimming, which Mason had mentioned to Evelyn, who had quietly earmarked a portion of the facility budget for an accessible pool that was now one of the design's central features. That was how most of it worked, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small attentions. At the groundbreaking, Evelyn spoke first. She'd gotten better at public speaking, at saying the true thing rather than the polished thing, at standing in front of a crowd and trusting that the honest version of herself was enough. She talked about the 14-month wait lists. She talked about what it cost a child to wait 14 months for the physical therapy that could change their trajectory. She talked about what it cost a parent to watch their child wait. She did not mention Daniel, and she did not make it about herself, but everyone who'd heard the story of where this had started understood the source of it. Then Patricia spoke, which was always worth experiencing. She had the oratorical instinct of someone who'd been doing community work for 30 years, the ability to make a large group feel like a conversation, and she spoke about what it meant to build something for a neighborhood by a neighborhood, and by the time she was done, several people were wiping their eyes, which Patricia accepted with the calm of someone accustomed to this outcome. Then, unexpectedly, Patricia had not told him she was going to do this. Patricia called Mason up. He hadn't prepared anything. He stood at the front of the small crowd with the October sun in his face and the construction-fenced lot behind him, and people he'd known for years, and people he'd met in the last year, and Evelyn at the edge of the gathering, watching him with an expression that he would have been hard-pressed to describe. And he said what was true. He said that he'd spent a lot of years believing that the most you could do was take care of your own corner of things, your kid, your block, your building. And he still believed that taking care of your own corner was not small. It was where everything started. But what he'd learned in the last year from people who were better at this than he was that your corner connected to other corners, and if you paid attention to where they joined, sometimes you could build something bigger than any of the corners alone. He said he knew families who were going to use this building. He knew a girl named Carmen who wanted to learn adaptive swimming. He knew a boy named Marcus, 8 years old, who'd been on the wait list for gait training therapy for 11 months, and who would, when the center opened, no longer be waiting. He said that the building they were about to put up was made of money and planning and good design. But what it was actually made of, what was underneath all of that, was the decision that a stranger on a train platform had made, to offer a seat, to ask a question, to bring soup when nobody asked for it. And what happened when that kind of decision compounded over time? He stopped there. He wasn't a man who knew how to end speeches. He just said thank you, and stepped back, and the crowd clapped, and Patricia gave him a look that said she hadn't expected that, and was not displeased. And when he made his way back to where Evelyn was, she looked at him without saying anything for a moment. "That was good," she said. "I had nothing prepared." "I know. That's why it was good." Lily, standing beside Evelyn, looked up at him. She'd been holding a small flag from the construction company, which she'd received when they arrived and treated as though it were ceremonial. "Dad got emotional," she announced, to nobody in particular. "I didn't get emotional," Mason said. "Your voice did the thing." "My voice didn't do a thing." "It absolutely did," Evelyn said. He looked at the two of them, side by side, Lily with her flag and Evelyn with the October light doing its October thing on her face, and the feeling that moved through him was one he had no good word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that. More like recognition, like standing in front of something and understanding, fully, that it was real. The center opened in March the following year, 16 months after the fundraiser, 5 months ahead of the original schedule because Evelyn, once a construction project was underway, was a force of nature with a spreadsheet and a very direct communication style that contractors found, as one of them put it to Mason privately, motivating. Carmen was the third patient through the door, her blue wheelchair traded in the previous fall for a new one that she'd chosen herself, bright orange. She had her first adaptive swimming assessment the day the pool was certified, and Mason heard about how it went from Rosa, who told him in the parking lot afterward with tears she seemed annoyed at herself for having. "She went underwater," Rosa said. "She put her face in the water and she came up laughing." She shook her head. "You don't understand what that is. For a kid who's been told for 2 years what she can't do. She put her face in the water and she came up laughing. He understood it. Not completely. There were dimensions of it he'd never fully understand, which was the honest truth of other people's experiences, and he'd learned to hold that honestly. But he understood enough. He'd watched a person he cared about spend 2 years being defined by limitation and then spend another year redefining herself on her own terms, and he knew what it looked like when someone found the water and came up laughing. He told Evelyn that evening. They were at her apartment, the west windows doing their end-of-day thing, dinner finished, Lily asleep in the guest room that had gradually become Lily's room over the preceding months, with her drawings on the walls and a collection of books on the shelf and the orange pillow she'd selected herself at the market on the corner. He told Evelyn about Carmen and the swimming pool and Rosa in the parking lot. Evelyn listened with her hands wrapped around her tea, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I needed to hear that," she said. "I know you did." She looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about the second center." Patricia mentioned the Riverside neighborhood. "There's a building that could work, and the city has a development incentive program for—" She stopped. "This isn't what we were talking about." "No, but it's good. Keep going." She looked at him. "I don't want to always be—" She made the gesture, the grip and release one. "Planning the next thing. I know I do it. It's how I survived, but I don't want to always be in the next thing when the current thing is—" She looked around her apartment, at the dinner plates not yet washed, at the west windows and the evening light, at him. "Good," she said simply. "When the current thing is good." He reached across and put his hand over hers. "Then stay here for a minute," he said. She turned her hand over, held his. "Okay," she said. The paper flower was still on his kitchen counter at home. It had been there for over a year and a half now, gone soft at the edges and slightly flattened on one side where Lily had knocked it once, and he'd repositioned it. He'd been asked about it, by Mrs. P., by his co-worker Denny, by Lily herself multiple times. And he'd always explained it the same way. A woman gave it to him on a train platform, and he'd kept it. This was true as far as it went. What he hadn't said out loud, though he'd thought it many times in the way you turned something over until it was smooth, was what the flower had actually been. It had been the first piece of proof that she was a person who paid attention, that she'd noticed something in a stranger that was worth acknowledging, that she'd taken the time, quietly, without announcement, to make something and leave it behind. He thought about this sometimes when he was at the counter making coffee in the morning, about how much information had been in that small folded paper, about how right he'd been not to throw it away. It wasn't a love story that announced itself. That was the thing about it, the thing he'd understood better as time passed. It had arrived in the ordinary packaging of an inconvenient train schedule and a caught wheelchair wheel and a cup of green tea from a cart that was not technically on the way from anywhere to anywhere. It had built itself out of soup and hospital visits and a 7-year-old's drawings and the back of 2 hands resting together in a room full of people doing good work. It had no single moment he could point to and say there, "That's when it started." It had started before he recognized it, the way most things that matter do. What he'd learned in the year and a half since October on Platform 7 was that the question of who you became after losing something was not answered in the losing. It was answered in what you did with the space the loss created, whether you filled it with walls or whether you left it open enough that something could eventually move through. He'd spent 6 years mostly building walls, not consciously, not with malice, but steadily. The walls of routine and responsibility, and the particular pride of a man who'd decided that needing nothing was the same as being strong. He'd been wrong about that. He knew that now in his body, not just his head. The way you knew things that had been tested by actual experience rather than just thought about. Evelyn had spent 2 years building different walls, better designed ones, with better architectural logic behind them. Walls that looked like competence and self-sufficiency and not burdening anyone. They'd been very good walls. They'd also been, in the end, just walls. What neither of them had expected, what you couldn't really expect, because it required another person and the right timing and a particular confluence of ordinary circumstances that nobody would have scripted, was that the way out of their respective walls would turn out to be almost embarrassingly simple. Almost. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic reversal, just a person showing up repeatedly without an agenda, Just soup, just tea, just sitting in a hospital room and not needing anything from the person in the bed. Just an empty seat on a crowded platform and the small decision to fill it. He thought about what Lily had said in the park months ago. You should just tell her, because then you know. 7 years old, and she'd already understood the central problem of adult emotional life. That people spent enormous energy managing the fear of knowing when the knowing, whatever it contained, was always better than the not knowing. She'd gotten that from Claire, he thought. Claire, who had never once in her life failed to say the things she meant, who had left cabinet doors open and burned the first batch of everything and filled every room she entered with her particular quality of presence. Claire, who had spent her last hours giving their daughter a name that meant something and who had been, in her entirely imperfect and irreplaceable way, the person who had shown him that love was not a careful thing. He carried her with him. He'd stopped thinking of that as weight a while ago. It was just part of his structure now, something built into the frame of him, the way certain experiences become not memories you visit, but architecture you live inside. She was there. Evelyn knew she was there. Lily was there, walking proof of her daily, with her mother's eyes and his jaw and her own fierce, independent self that belonged to nobody but her. There was room for all of it. That was what he hadn't known in those first years of grief. That it wasn't a competition between the past and whatever came next. That you didn't have to diminish one to make space for the other. The house was big enough. He was sitting on Evelyn's couch on a Sunday in April, a year since the fundraiser, 2 years almost exactly since October on Platform 7, when Lily came in from the guest room with a drawing she'd just finished and held it out to Evelyn. For the new center, Lily said, Patricia said she needed more art for the walls. Evelyn took it. She studied it with the seriousness she always gave Lily's work. The flowers had evolved over the year, still energetic, still slightly wrong-shaped, but now there were figures in them, people, recognizable in the way that a child's drawing was recognizable when you knew the child. Which one's me? Evelyn said. Lily pointed. You gave me a cape, Evelyn said. You can have a cape, Lily said, as though this were self-evident. I'm in a wheelchair and I have a cape. The wheelchair makes it more aerodynamic, Lily said, completely seriously. And something happened in Evelyn's face that Mason had seen before but never got used to. The thing where the composure didn't crack exactly but became transparent, where what was underneath it showed through clearly. She pulled Lily into a hug. Brief, slightly awkward, because Evelyn was still someone who hugged like she was learning the geometry of it, like she knew the theory but was still calibrating the practice. Lily didn't seem to notice or didn't care, leaning into it with the uncomplicated ease of a child who understood she was wanted. Mason watched from the couch. Some things he'd found you didn't need to name out loud to know what they were. You just needed to let yourself look at them directly, without flinching, and understand that this was real and you were in it, and it was not going to be perfect, and it was not going to be easy, and it was, without question, worth every complicated inch of itself. That evening, after Lily was asleep and the dinner was done and the west windows had gone from orange to dark, Evelyn said, I looked at the Riverside building today, for the second center, and it needs significant renovation. It's going to be harder than the first one. But, she looked at him, but it's in the right neighborhood and the bones are good. So you're doing it. She considered this, or pretended to. I'm going to need someone to attend a lot of community meetings. I'm free most evenings. I know you are. Evelyn. What? I love you, he said, the words in the air between them. Simple, plain, said with the same directness he'd finally managed to apply to everything else. She was still. The particular stillness. I know, she said, and then, after a moment, in the careful way of someone lifting something they'd been holding a long time and choosing to set it down in front of another person. I love you too. He nodded. She looked at her tea. He looked at the dark windows. Outside, the city was doing its city thing. Indifferent, continuous, full of platforms and strangers and small decisions being made in ordinary moments that nobody would ever be able to fully trace forward to what they became. Somewhere in it, a train was pulling into Garfield Station, and someone was standing on Platform 7, and the 447 was coming. He thought about a Thursday afternoon in October, a caught wheel, A woman with her hair pulled back and dark eyes that decided in 10 seconds whether you were trustworthy. He thought about a paper flower he'd found in his jacket pocket on the stairs. It was still on his kitchen counter. It would stay there. He'd decided that without deciding it, the way you decided things that were already true. Some things you just kept. Not because they were perfect, and not because they were painless, and not because they didn't cost you something every time you looked at them, but because they were the beginning of everything that came after. And everything that came after had been against the odds, against the weight of everything they'd both lost and carried and built walls around, had been, in its flawed and incomplete and ongoing way, worth it. That was the thing nobody told you about after the worst thing. That after wasn't the absence of the worst thing. It was just more life, arriving anyway, whether you were ready or not, carrying in it the ordinary materials of everything that might still be possible. A seat on a crowded platform, a cup of tea from a cart that was not on the way, a person who showed up. That was how it started. That was how it always started. And if you were paying attention, if you were even a little brave, even a little willing to hold out your hand into the uncertain space of another person's life, that was also, more often than you'd expect, how it became something that lasted.